and try to give you not or rather the opposite view of yours, whereas the university as an evaluator, but rather to see the university being evaluated, or the evaluation sort of guiding universities. And I will try to draw on some of my previous work and ongoing work, together also with others in this room, to make sort of an overall claim here. And to do that, I would like to go back actually to Gille's presentation yesterday. I think you set the stage very nicely for, for what I wanted to say. My overall kind of argument that I'm trying to push in various ways is that the idea of a global market for universities is increasingly shaping higher education agendas, university reforms, etc., and fundamentally challenging the purpose and function of higher education and of universities. I think you, Gilly, called it global imagination. And I think that was a very, very good word. I've sort of tried to think of it in terms of it's the idea of a global market rather than actually there being a market. And I think the global imagination speaks very well to that. I think this is what this is about. We have an imagination of this field being global, and that is increasingly guiding us in what we do. And I think you also showed us the importance, or the sort of risk with this, Gilly, yesterday, that it's not necessarily so that this is equally beneficial for everyone, or in all contexts. So what do I want to say about this idea of a global university and how it is guiding us? Well, my starting point for that is that I've become very interested in the notion, or the rhetoric rather, of competition in this field. I think this notion of competition really underscores this idea of a market. And this competition rhetoric, I think we see everywhere. And I've seen it and I've studied it in various forms. I'm just finishing a project on the autonomy reform that Lars mentioned yesterday that we had in Swedish university sector a couple of years ago, where this was driven a lot by this whole notion of we're now in global competition, so we have to frame our universities or reshape our universities in order to be competitive and in order to be active players on a global market, or this sort of imagery of a global market. I've also studied this in European, or the EU, research policy initiatives and the development of the European Research Area, the creation of the European Research Council, and various developments there, where this competition, I would argue, really shaped this idea of even attempting to create the framework for research policy across Europe, which wasn't at all, a given. But competition and competition mechanisms were very key in those developments. I'll try to give you an example later if I have time. I've also apparently, as most of you know, studied ranking systems, and I think ranking systems is a sort of a very good illustration of how this competition is guiding us, or what shapes this competition, or the idea of competition. We seem to take this, I think, competition and competitiveness idea for granted. But two things have started me getting thinking about what this competition really is, or what is competition in this field. And one observation came from many of you have heard this before, came from my ranking studies when I studied European business schools rankings in the early 2000s. And I interviewed at Stockholm School of Economics. Sorry, Torkel, I know. But I know also that you agree on my view on this. But when I interviewed at Stockholm School of Economics, this was early 2000, they had just been ranked, and they said, oh, this is fantastic, these rankings. It's really shifted us from being a local player to being a global player. And when I asked them what that meant and who they compared with, they say, oh, we compete with Stanford and Wharton and Harvard. And I said, how do you compete with Harvard? Well, oh, we have this great MBA program, you know, and we attract students globally, and they really sort of benchmarked with Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton most prominently. And that's a bit curious to me, how this sort of, I doubt that, I don't know, maybe you have other views on that, but I doubt that Harvard and Stanford are thinking very hardly about competition from Stockholm School of Economics. Maybe they are, but I could be wrong on that. So it's certainly not a very clear competitive situation here. I've also looked into strategy documents of Swedish universities after this autonomy reform that we had, driven in large part by this competition rhetoric. And they don't write as much as I'd expected on, or a few of them do, on this competitiveness. But some of them are starting to introduce this. And this was one of the universities that sort of, and I think this is quite interesting, setting this whole competition notion at the starting point. A starting point for a strategy work is that all of the university's activities are increasingly subject to competition. And significant efforts have been invested to increase awareness of this. So it's not sort of given, but we have to sort of start to learn or teach people that, that we are competing. But whenever I try to find in these strategy documents what do they think they're competing about or who are they competing for, it's very unclear. It's very clear that it's global competition, but whenever they do talk specifically about competition, it is within Sweden. And that, of course, has to do with most higher education organizations in Sweden are funded. 85 or 90, 95, between 85 and 95% of national funding or government funding. 2.5% generally comes from the EU funding, and roughly the same from other international sources. So we're still heavily funded nationally, of course. And our student base is also very national. So what is it, then, this competition? And this is the argument that I'm making with Nils in a book chapter. The book is not out yet, but maybe it will come. Where we tried to say, well, if we one way to understand this is to try to think differently about competition for resources, which in the Swedish case is obviously very national, and competition for status, which can then be something else and does not have to be tied to the funding and the systems that we have. So the argument is that on this idea of the global market, universities are competing primarily for status, not necessarily so much for resources. I mean, this status striving and status competition is nothing new. It's general or commonplace in science, and we know this. And it's sort of, we had the argument yesterday that this is sort of ingrained in us and in what we do. We compete for attention, for research findings, for priority, for funding, for positions, etc. So this competition, primarily at the individual level, is sort of ingrained in our profession. My argument is that this is now becoming interlinked with competition for universities. And what we saw in the Swedish reform is that they're making universities the entities for competition, or at least that's the attempt. Here I draw on what Nils was talking about yesterday, about organizing or organization, outside organizations is how you say it. I would like to see it as organizing processes. And I think one of the things, we know that status competition is not new, but one of the things I think what we see is that we see attempts, lots of attempts to organize this status competition, particularly to organize it globally or between countries. And these efforts, obviously, there are plenty of them. global ranking lists, R1, accreditations, etc. And I see this as sort of organizing approval, in a sense. And it goes well with the thinking that it's status that's being organized here. So rankings, awards, prizes, accreditations, quality assurance procedures, evaluations of all kinds are sort of used to organize this status competition. And I think what I can say a lot of things about that. One of the things that I have elaborated in a recent paper is the difference between different types of these types of organizing mechanisms. Rankings are obviously one here. We've contrasted that a bit in a chapter on awards and how awards function. But I think one of the things that I think is interesting, particularly with rankings, is that they're very explicit about how they organize this competition. They set very clear standards. They have very clear rules for who can be included in the rankings, for what it is that you have to do if you are to be included in the rankings, and the implications of that. And that means, I think, and that this is an argument that goes back to my earlier ranking studies, what this does is that it provides very clear templates for organizations that they can use. And we do use these templates when organizing, when reorganizing, and when changing. So I think rankings and these types of systems, evaluation systems, are influential because they provide these templates for action, and they become tied to what it is that we do. And in this field particularly, we have seen how research is sort of the key measure that we use for the status competition, and it was also commented on yesterday. And how we measure research then becomes integral. We have all these FT45 lists, ABS lists, A-journal ranking lists, but also citation measures and all these kinds of mechanisms to do that. But I think what's interesting with these are both that they're very formalized and mechanical in one sense, but also that they're very tied to our research practice, to what we do as professionals. And therefore, these developments are very much helped by the profession itself. I mean, we promote these because research and research evaluation is what we do. And as you were saying, we do these evaluations all the time, and increasingly so. So we're also part of forming this. And obviously, we also see these being engaged at now the national level. Excellence initiatives we heard Georg talk about yesterday, world-class university schemes to Nigeria now has a plan to have 2 universities in the top 200 of the Shanghai rankings by 2020. So that's sort of one way we also strategize about this. And I'm about to finish. I think the results of this, and this goes back to Gilles' presentation yesterday, this is obviously an elite and not really a sense of getting everybody involved or using higher education and research for the benefit of everything. This is benefiting clearly an elite or those that perceive an elite. It's selectively global in the sense that not every part of the globe is included. I counted a couple of years ago, if I look at the 8 biggest rankings on universities, 91 of the top 300 are US universities. There's a very heavy emphasis on US, and if you include North America, it's even heavier. So there's US, parts of Europe, and small parts of Asia, basically, that is included in this global. We do see that these mechanisms can change positions over time. And I've looked into that a little bit as well. But it happens quite slowly and not in any type of revolutionary ways. And we know that from other studies that reputation tends to be sticky. So thank you.
Thank you.